This is Jacob with J&D Photography, and you're watching this edition of the Sunday Edit. Today's edit comes from the wedding of Elizabeth and Fletcher that I took a couple of months ago. And if you look at this picture, you'll see that it's really underexposed. And so today I want to talk about intentionally underexposing an image to preserve certain details in the picture. Now, normally if you look at a picture like this, you would say, oh my goodness, this is horrible. It's terribly underexposed, like this is not properly exposed at all. But to me, exposure is actually a relative subject because cameras can only capture a certain amount of detail in a single image. And typically, even with today's modern sensors, most of the information is buried in the shadows rather than the highlights. So if you look at this picture, you'll see that our highlight detail, which is right here, is very well preserved, but our shadow detail is kind of underexposed. But what's really cool is that if I bring the exposure slider up to properly expose the image, which is about here, and then I bring the highlights down, all that information is still retained. And it's a little washed out, so what we can do is bring some dehazing into this. And boom, we have a properly exposed picture with all of our highlights and shadows in order. Now, there is one drawback to doing this. When you do bring up the exposure from the shadows, you do introduce a little bit of noise, but that can easily be fixed with a little bit of noise reduction, and we'll just apply about 30 luminance or so. And as you can see, that cleans up the noise from the shadows, like so easily. So when we go from before and after, we start here, and we end up here. And we have a wonderful image where the highlights are all contained properly and the shadows are exposed properly. And this is something that I always think about while I'm shooting. You know, what is the exposure range? Because if you look at the exposure on the top, I pushed this image about 4 stops of light, which is a huge range in terms of dynamic range. So if I had properly exposed this image to where the shadows had been here, instead of exposing for the highlights, that information would have been gone. So here, as an example, like here's an image which is properly exposed, and if you look at the highlights, they are absolutely clipped. I mean, that's just gone. And if I pull down on the highlights, it's not there. Pull down on the exposure, just gone. So as you can see, like if you don't properly expose for the highlights and they clip, they're just gone, which is why I chose to underexpose this image in order to preserve the highlights. Thanks for tuning in to this episode. Hope this has been informative, and I can't wait to see you next Sunday for the next edit. Take it easy.